We cannot understand the onslaught on Israel and the Jews unless we understand what the West has done to itself. And we can't understand what the West has done to itself unless we understand that at the root of that is its own onslaught on Judaism. So that's my analysis, and it's pretty unsparing. But nevertheless, I am incredibly optimistic, partly because I live in this crazy place now. And I would say that this is the Jewish moment. For both the Jewish people and the state of Israel, this moment of crisis for us, and it is obviously an immense crisis, it can also be seen as the Jewish moment in the world. It's a seismic moment in Jewish and world history, which I believe has the capacity to change both the Jewish world and the wider world for the better, if the opportunities are taken. Big if, but let me spell out why I think this is so. The West, as I've indicated, is going down. I believe that the Jewish people and the state of Israel can help save the West from going off the edge of the cliff. Instead of viewing the Jewish people as a baffling nuisance and viewing Israel as a source of regional and global uproar, both the West and the wider Jewish world should be encouraged to see both Israel and the Jewish people as a rescue remedy for a culture that's basically in the terminal ward. And I think I would suggest there are three reasons why I say this. The first is that Judaism is essential to Western civilization. The second is that the unique selling point of the Jewish people is cultural survival. We do cultural survival like nobody else has ever done cultural survival. And the third point is that Israel itself is demonstrating, and has demonstrated for the past terrible 21 months, key reasons why it will survive and thrive and become a power in the world, while as things stand, the West may not survive at all. So let me just explain those three different points. Why is Judaism essential to the West? Most people don't think about Judaism when they think of the West. They think of the Greeks. They think that Western values are civilized values and that they are kind of imprinted in our DNA. They think that Western values are universal values. Everybody basically subscribes to them. Just a few things get in the way of them being practiced. Well, I do believe that Western values are civilized values, and I also believe that civilized values came from the Hebrew Bible. What do I mean by civilized values? I mean things like respect for every human life, taking responsibility for your own actions, their consequences, compassion and kindness, putting other people first, justice and the rule of law, political freedom and civic equality. Now, these principles, which I think are dear to all of us in the West, or should be, both secular and religious, whatever creed we come from, they didn't come from the Greeks, and they're not part of our DNA. They're not universal. One only has to think of the cruelties of Chinese society, the barbarism of ancient Greece, or the core doctrine of submission in the Islamic world to realize these values are far from universal. They came from the Hebrew Bible. Judaism's moral codes, which were pioneering, revolutionary moral codes, promoted justice, individual dignity, and kindness. These and others lie at the heart of the West's signature principles of humane, orderly, and civilized behavior. If we are obsessed by the ancient Greeks, well, their political system embodied in the city-state was an end in itself. Power, for them, was a virtue. Philosophical principles were a system, and it was in the system that virtue resided. There was no concept of promoting the interests of all individuals, but by contrast, the principles of the Mosaic Code created community based on duty and responsibility, inner directed moral direction, and respect for every human being, because every human being was regarded as made in the image of God. Remove the image of God, and you don't have respect for every human being. Whatever people in the West may say, whatever the secular people may say, of course we have respect for every human being. That's just civilized. Actually, they have imbibed the values that were put into the West by Christianity, but basically came from Judaism. They don't like to admit it because only imbeciles are religious, as we know. But nevertheless, that's where they came from. So much is obvious, or should be obvious, to anybody who thinks about the moral principles of Judaism. But what is less obvious, but what is even more striking, is that principles that were revolutionary in ancient Judaism have been essential to democracy as we know it. These principles, which were revolutionary when the ancient Israelites invented them, I would suggest there are two principles which I would say are particularly important. One was the idea of limited government, the fact that the king, the ruler of ancient Israel, was constrained. He was not to be considered the absolute ruler. The absolute ruler was the Almighty. And around the king, on his own level, were people called prophets and judges. So, okay, this was a doctrine, this was a council of perfection. There were many kings who were despotic and bad and so on, but that was the template. And that was revolutionary, the idea that, it was desirable for the ruler to be constrained in his power over the people. That wasn't what was true of the ancient world at all. That was the first principle I would say was very important. The second principle, no less important, was the idea that law by which everybody was bound in the society had to be founded in the consent of the people. And that was in the Mosaic Code when Moses came down the mountain and said, "Here is the law to the Israelites. Do you agree? Will you do it?" And the people said, "Yes, we'll do it." That was revolutionary. And that principle meant that everyone was bound by the same law, so you had civic equality of civil status, and that brought everybody together. It helped unite disparate tribes. Now, in the 18th century, when Britain's Puritans founded what became the constitutional monarchy of Britain, and founded, in effect, the essence of what was to become parliamentary democracy, those people in 18th century England drew explicitly upon the Hebrew Bible in providing these and other principles by which they wished to produce a situation in which the king and the church would be constrained by laws made by Parliament, which was elected by the people. They drew that from the Hebrew Bible, and they said so. And the same kind of people went to America and founded America on precisely the same principles, and just like in Britain, produced pamphlets and books and tracts and sermons, whatever, giving explicit credit to the Hebrew Bible for these principles. And so not only were these two principles very important, but most fundamentally, what was key to all this was the Jews' sense of themselves as a people, as a nation, not just as a country, which of course they weren't ever since they were removed when the Romans threw them out. But they were a self-conscious unit characterized by a very strong sense of shared culture and purpose, and crucially by equality of civil status. So that was, the essence of what we now understand to be Western democracy, came from us. And then there was science. Now, everybody knows that only clever people do science, and only secular people are clever, and only secular people are scientists. And the idea that religion has anything to do with science, and science has anything to do with religion, is simply for the birds. Okay, well, where do we get science from? Well, let's go back to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks explained the natural world by abstract principles. Socrates thought that empirical observation was a waste of time, and Plato advised his students to, quote, leave the starry heavens alone. Western science, by contrast, grew from the idea that the universe was rational. And that belief that the universe was rational was given to us by Bereshit, by the book of Genesis, which set out the revolutionary proposition that the universe had a rational creator. Without a purposeful, singular intelligence behind it, the universe could not have been rational, and there would have been therefore no place for reason in the world, and no truths or natural laws for reason to operate on through observation, analysis, and deduction to uncover, and that was science. Science is a Western thing. Okay, other civilizations certainly have had science, but they've all basically gone round in circles and hit a dead end, to mix my metaphors. It's only the West where science was this engine of progress which continues without end. Progress, science is that sort of science is a Western thing. Progress is a Western thing. Modernity is a Western thing. And without Christianity's base in Judaism, there would have been, I would suggest, no Western science, no Western progress, and no Western modernity. And so that's what Judaism has given to the West. Next is Jewish survival. Let's look at Jewish survival and what that can teach the West. Well, the Jews have had over the centuries a horrific attrition rate. We have lost countless numbers to persecution, to extermination, and to assimilation. Nevertheless, the Jewish people has survived persecution and pogroms and genocide. It's survived and thrived as a people, while every culture that's tried to destroy us has vanished. So how have the Jewish people done this? It's another long story, but in a nutshell, Judaism is all about promoting its own continuity and reinforcing its culture and its sense of itself as a nation. It understands the crucial point that the present must connect with the past in order to have a future. And it does this by telling a collective story about itself. It transmits this story through education, which has been a kind of sacred duty through the generations, through a web of custom and tradition, and through memorialization, both through celebrating the culture and through celebrating the achievements and memorializing its losses. Upon seeing the Jews observing the fast of Tisha B'Av, sitting on the floor and weeping, Napoleon reputedly said, "Any nation that still cries after 1,500 years is guaranteed to return." Now, what the Jews have embodied is a veneration of tradition, which forms a kind of unbroken thread stretching from the past to the present and guaranteeing a future, because it cements succeeding generations into a culture they feel they share with their ancestors as a kind of sacred bond which they have to continue, to which they feel a deep sense of connection and obligation, and which creates in turn a strong sense of community and social bonds. No less important, the entire structure of religious observance in Judaism was built around the collective. While the individual was responsible for his or her own behavior, religious rituals were inseparable from nation building and forming a lasting community. And this meant a tremendous emphasis on the importance of having children and transmitting the culture to successive generations. The key to all this is the Jews' identification as a people. It's why diaspora Jews are disappearing, because they've lost that sense of themselves as a people, and why Israel is in such a very different situation. So why will Israel survive while at present the West will not? Well, in Israel, the birth rate is key. Women are having on average 3 to 4 babies per woman. In the West, they are literally dying out. The key point is that Israeli Jews understand themselves to belong to the nation state of the Jewish people, which makes sense of their existence. Israeli Jews know and value their ancient identity. They may not be religiously observant, but they feel part of an ancient tradition that is a religious one. And I think that the current terrible war has illustrated the real core of Israel's strength, because we've seen in example after example soldiers who have said, in terms, they are not just fighting to save their country from annihilation, which of course they are, but they're fighting for the survival of their people. They feel this is a sacred duty passed down from antiquity. They say they feel literally the spirits of all those Jews who died in generations past behind them and who kept the Jewish people alive through persecution and extermination. This sense of peoplehood creates meaning and purpose essential for national spirit. So in conclusion, I would say this. Now, I've got many more points that I could make, but time presses. I think that above all, what is the key point is what I would call Jewish peoplehood. And what Israel should be doing is telling both Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel and people in the West about the lessons to be learned from this. that in order for a culture to survive, you've got to love what it is, and you've got to value what it is. And there's plenty in the West to value and to love. Unfortunately, the West has told itself there's nothing to value or to love. And that's the way a culture dies. The Jewish people keep the culture alive because they love it. They revere it. They think it's good for you as an individual. They think it's good for you as a community. They think it's good in terms of producing values which are invaluable because they're so civilized. Israel should be telling the West not just that Israel is fighting the West's war against an Islamic death cult. It should be giving the West the cultural weapons to fight their own death cult, the West's own death cult, the West's apparent embrace of cultural suicide. Israel's lesson to the West is that the nation is not the route to nationalism and fascism. It is, in fact, essential to defend freedom and democracy and the core values of your society. You do this through education, through prioritizing the traditional family, to prioritizing the nation itself. My final conclusion is this. Israel, I think we can see, is currently, through this war and how it will develop, I don't know, but it certainly has the potential to reshape the geopolitical architecture of the region and world politics for the better. And what I'm suggesting is that Israel and the Jewish people can also reshape now the cultural architecture of the West. I said at the start that we can only understand the attack on Jews by the attack by the West on itself, and we can only understand the attack on the West by the West on itself if we understand that at the root of that is its attack on Judaism. Turn this on its head. Western civilization can only be saved by nurturing and defending Israel, Judaism, and the Jewish people. And for that to happen, we have to start educating ourselves. We have to start to telling ourselves as Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, is that the message that we can give the West is that a culture that understands and values what it is will live, and Israel wants to live. Israel chooses life, while a culture that despises itself and wants to erase its particular and historic identity will die. And that is, I think, a lesson of the most immense value that we can give to the West. It doesn't want to hear it, doesn't understand it needs to hear it. Many Jews need to hear it as well. They need to understand. Those Jews who try to wrap themselves in the universalism of the West, both in the diaspora and here in Israel, need to understand that they are therefore wrapping themselves in a culture that is self-destructive and will destroy itself, whereas the culture they should wrap themselves in is Jewish peoplehood, in which case they will choose life, as we all have here. Thank you.